Welcome, and Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam Asher Kitshanu B'mitzvotav V'tzivanu La'asok B'divrei Torah. I'm wearing a silk shirt, so it and the talit do not cling very well, so I have that fun exercise to do. So, of course, we are dealing with the issue of Tzara'at, and off camera, so to speak, we got into quite a little bit of discussion as to the significance of it and the fact that it appears on our skin. On a totally different subject, or a somewhat different subject, I've been thinking about the word Chesed, and the fact that the word Chesed is translated as kindness, and just really thinking a lot about that, about the lack of kindness that goes on, and the degree to which kindness could be a transformative kind of thing. There's a beautiful expression that is found especially in Psalms, and that is Ki le'olam chasdo, that is, for his kindness endures forever, describing divine kindness and trying to think what exactly that means. And of course, we do see cruelty in the world. We do see terrible things happening. And yet there is a belief that despite all of that, that God is capable and in fact performs deep acts of kindness. And perhaps some of that has to do with how we might understand or better understand when we're in a different kind of place. Perhaps when we're at the end of our lives, or perhaps when we enter the next world, we'll be able to look back on the events of our lives and say, wow, these actually were things that we thought were awful, were actually in many ways acts of kindness. That's a huge piece of belief to have to hang on to or to swallow, but I think that that's where it's going, and referring in some ways to our own lack of understanding, but to hold on to the idea that God is so essentially kind. This phrase, Ki le'olam chasdo, is mentioned a lot of times, and in many ways, it leads us, at least certainly leads me, to try and drill down into and deconstruct my own life and look at the various components of it and see them as all acts of divine blessing and divine love and divine kindness. And it's undeserved. At least I can talk about myself and say that in so many ways, so many of these things are undeserved. Another point is that if in fact part of our enterprise, entering into the spiritual journey that we call Judaism, has to do with trying to synthesize our own lives with this divine source, it becomes a huge mitzvah, a huge commandment for us to act in kind ways and to really use kindness as a touchstone for what comes out of our mouths and what we do for people and how we react to the world around us. That in fact, that is a great element of what is going on here in describing God in this way, Ki le'olam chasdo, that every day and every moment, if we have decisions to make, that particular issue of kindness be part of the way in which we make decisions. And as I said, certainly what comes out of our mouths, to make sure that it is said with kindness. And again, the word kindness is a generality, and we have to figure out for ourselves how we express that kindness, what specific ways we take in order to show kindness. Obviously, part of it is observing that principle that Hillel said about the foundation of Torah being what is hateful to you, don't do to your neighbor. Because obviously, if you contravene that particular principle, that wipes kindness off the map. So at the very least, we should not be treating people in ways that we wouldn't want to be treated ourselves. And when you meditate on that kind of thing, on kindness as representing that, but obviously going a lot beyond that as well, being generous, being supportive, being appreciative, all those kinds of things. And then ask yourself, how does that transform my life? And if enough people were doing that, if people in general were acting with that kind of principle as a very basis of how they behave, how transformative would that be to the world? It would change the world if we were aware of that. And just to try and be able to be kind, and certainly at times when it's very challenging, when someone's being unkind to us, how do we react? Is there a way we can still be kind even when they're not being kind to us? And what form does kindness take in that particular situation? And in some ways, justice and equity, but certainly justice, may be involved in trying to act in a kind way. Because I think people sometimes confuse justice with vengeance. And the truth is that if there's any emotion involved and any pleasure in seeing someone punished, that is no longer justice. You cannot be happy to see someone punished. It may be a necessary component, that is to say, justice in that particular case, and in that case, punishment in a way, has to do with a necessary thing, but not to feel happy to see it happen. We have no right whatsoever to feel that way, given our own imperfections. And please God, we're not as cruel or wrong or do as wickedly as some people practice, but regardless, it's not for us to act as if we're so just or so right, etc., that we have a right to gain any pleasure from the punishment of the wicked. So just a few things that I've been thinking about lately on this word Chesed, and I think it's an incredible word, and what exactly is involved. And I think it's because I see such a lack of kindness that's going on in society in general, and certainly in parts of the world, and how it affects people and how it hurts, etc., and how different things would be if people thought about that and felt a need to try and practice Chesed. So I felt that I wanted to share that with you this morning, even though it's off topic, but I felt it was important enough to try and share with you. And of course, I'd love for you to share whatever reactions you have to this.
First of all, I want to say amen. I mean, you couldn't have said it any more beautifully. And as you were talking about it, it was just opening my mind to my own life, and where I notice not just, my own lack of chesed at times, but where I see problems being because of each of our inability to look through those lenses. Thank you.
You bet. Yeah, I agree. I mean, this little sermon that I'm giving is for myself. How other people want to take it, etc., and apply it. But yeah, I agree, Lisa, and I appreciate your sharing what you just did. Thank you. Any other thoughts before we try and plunge into the topic at hand? Okay, very good.
Wait.
Okay.
So sorry, I was just trying to get off the mute button. I also agree with Lisa. I guess that the only question that I have about this is maybe it's more closure, but if someone wrongs you and then, they're basically punished for it. So what, what emotion are you supposed to feel? Is it just closure? Are you saying you shouldn't take pleasure in someone else getting punished? But if they've done severe, if they've wronged you severely, then yeah, that kind of seems, that seems very difficult. It's not necessarily pleasure, but it's, I don't know. At least, you should be allowed to feel relief or something. I guess that's my point. So.
Okay, yeah, David, thank you for raising that. So if I'm not mistaken, and please correct me because I don't know enough about this subject, but I thought that that's kind of what restorative justice is about, that this is exactly what they mean when they're talking about restorative justice, is that when you see a person, paying the price for what they've done wrong, that you find a way to forgive them in your heart. You don't hold on to whatever hurt and anger that you've had against them. And that, in fact, sometimes I know of cases where people who have been terribly wronged, even with a murderer, right, and have gone up to that person and actually had some kind of relationship with that person. Please God, we should be spared from such situations. But
Yep.
I think that's what restorative justice tries to get to, and to see it in that particular, that when a person's paid their price to society, not to bear the grudge and keep bearing the grudge against them. I think it's a more common situation where people are neglectful or even may be trying to be retaliatory, not in a heavy kind of way, but in a small kind of way, like making you wait extra long because they're bothered by you. These small kinds of peccadillos, all right? And I've experienced myself, some in a case of someone who could be seen as and viewed as acting in that kind of way. Instead, trying to be kind to that person and thoughtful and sort of seeing their point of view, etc. And the truth is the results have been extraordinary. And I don't want to go into the various details only because of time and I don't want to bore you, but I think that we all just thirst for kindness. And I think that when we are treated in a kind way, it's something I think I'm almost willing to say you never forget. And whether it's from a company, can be from a business. And I've experienced that as well, by the way, where instead of being businesslike, they've actually been kind and thoughtful, or individuals. But I think as I said, I think it's transformative. And it just opens up a door for someone who might be feeling resentful to just melt that resentment and actually be able to act in a kind way themselves. It can be very catching, I believe. I mean, I realize there are people who sadly, have some kind of, illness, you might say, spiritual illness, where they simply take advantage of kindness. But I think those people are relatively far and few between compared to the number of people who so appreciate being treated kindly.
Thank you. That helps a lot. I appreciate it.
You bet. And of course, allowing ourselves to get rid of the burden of resentment and anger and bearing a grudge, those are very heavy weights, spiritual weights. And when you can get them off your shoulders, out of your heart, out of your head, it's like liberating. It's liberating. And I think it affects your physical as well as your mental health.
Rabbi, I know this is wonderful, as you said, but I'll never be kind to the Holocaust. The people on the Holocaust are Nazis. Never will I have a grudge against them, not their grandchildren who never knew about that. Okay, but the Nazis themselves, I'll never be kind to them. I'll never forgive them.
Again, I don't think forgiveness is for us to give or not to forgive. I think we have to leave it to God to decide what the right thing to do is. You're obviously raising an incredible issue, but I have to tell you, there was a woman in our community who wrote a book and talked about forgiving what happened. She went through the Holocaust herself. Her name is Lillian Judd. She's passed on, but Lillian Judd was able to do that. And she herself went through the camps and was personally affected. Her family was affected. She started off in Hungary, and she preached a very strong message of finding ways to forgive and to move on. So, I'm sure Dennis would love for you to have a copy of this book that she wrote of her life and how she managed to find a way to forgive. And those of you who live in Santa Rosa and part of the Bethany community certainly know about Lillian Judd.
She was an incredible woman. The name of her book that she wrote with her son is From Auschwitz to Forgiveness.
So Harlan, it might be, if you're into reading at all, once your eyes are settled down and you can read again, this would be something to consider. If I think of it and can do it, I will try and send you a copy. Okay. One has to be able to do this. It's a great lesson. All right, let's go into the text again, unless anybody wants to add anything else. All right. Let me find it. Okay. Let me back off a second. Let me say this. This is such an arcane subject. And I showed you just briefly how Torah Temimah wrote an introduction to it. Here it is. I started working on it, but this is just, whether or not we should just stay with the Rashi. But this is what he says. Hakdamak Tzara'at Negaim. He says a brief introduction to the section dealing with Negaim. Essentially, we're talking about the leprosy, Tzara'at. And here's what he says. Ya'an, because ki partei dine parsha zo, the details, right, the specifics of the laws of this particular chapter. Rabim are many, va'atikim he, and they're ancient. They're very ancient. Va'einam shgurim, and they are not, they're unfamiliar. They're not familiar. Gam befi harbe lomdei Torah, even amongst many of those who are actually Torah scholars. So he's saying many Torah scholars aren't familiar with the specific laws of this. And he goes on to say, and the reason for this, the reason is shekimat kol dinei haparsha, that almost all the laws of this particular section, lo nitparshu b'gemara, they're not explained, they're not set out, they're not detailed out in the Gemara, in the Talmud. Rak b'Torah Kohanim, they're only mentioned essentially or spelled out in the Sifra. Lachen, for this reason, Natzia Bazeh, we're going to set out Rashi, the main, the Yisodei, and the principles, Yediot Klaliyot, of the general ideas, Hashayachot Lahafrasha, which apply to interpreting this section. Vayu Ka'ein Mavo, and it will be as a kind of introduction, Lavo El Tocha Pnima, to be able to enter into it in depth. So this is the general introduction that he makes, and it is pretty brief. This is paragraph 1, paragraph 2, paragraph 3, and paragraph 4. And I believe that's it. And he tries to outline the various times. I started looking at paragraph 1, and it may be helpful to at least do that. Okay. He started working on paragraph 2. but he says, Shlosha minei tzara'at. He says there are basically three kinds of tzara'at. Okay, number one, Aleph, tzara'at or habasa. So he says the tzara'at of the skin of the flesh, basically of one's skin, right? Number two, shchin umichva. The second type of tzara'at is boils or a burn. Okay, and the third kind is karachat vegabachat or netek. So he says this has to do with a bald spot on the head, right? And karachat has to do with, in Hebrew, there are two different words that describe where the baldness is occurring. So karachat could be towards the back or the middle of the back of the head, and the gabachat could be the forehead, that where the forehead has gotten bald, or netek. I know that they translate netek as a fret, but frankly, I'm unfamiliar with the English word fret. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that word. But again, I assume it has to do with kind of some place where the hair has been removed or come off. V'zeh tchunatan klalam. And these are their attributes and their general principles. Tzara'at or habasar, okay, when it comes to describing the tzara'at on a person's skin, tzarich sheyalbin makom min haor. It has to be that there's a place in the skin which has become white, right? That's faded. So a certain part of the skin has now faded. Kafi sheyit ba'er, as will be clarified in section 4. He's talking about that last section of this introduction. Ushlosha simenei tum'aba, and there are three signs of impurity associated with this. Sa'ar lavan, the hair has become white. Mechia ufishyon. So this, again, I was struggling and working hard with this word michya. And I believe the word michya means that it's raw. In other words, that there's that you see raw flesh. Ufishyon, or it's spreading. Somehow it's spreading. So he says, kagon, for example, im yeshbo baheret, if there is in it a spot, uva sa'ar lavan, and in that spot on the skin there is a white hair, or michyat basar chai, or again, we're talking about raw flesh. Maybe we can call it an eruption of raw flesh. Machlito hakohen miyad latuma. So in that case, the kohen, please excuse me, the kohen determines that it is immediately that this is impure. In other words, that it's a case of tzara'at, if he sees these things. Ve'im ein ba ka'ela, but if he doesn't see these kinds of symptoms, maskiro hakohen shivat yamim, the kohen puts him into quarantine for 7 days. Uvashvi'i, and on the 7th day, ro'ehu, he examines him. Im nolad ba sa'ar lavan, and if there now appears a white hair, or michya, or any rawness, or shepashta v'hosifa, or that in fact it is spread, right? It's gotten larger, ba'or, in the skin, machlito letuma. In that case, he determines that he has tzara'at. V'im lo noldu ba kol ela, but if it doesn't have these three things, v'gam lo pasta, or pashta, and it had not spread, it hasn't spread, yaskirenu shavua sheni, he then puts him into quarantine for a 2nd week. V'im la'achar hashavua hasheni, and if after the 2nd week, nolad echad me'elu, he then sees an appearance of one of these things, machalito l'tuma, he's then determined to be have tzara'at. Now, what it what it may mean is that he doesn't have all three symptoms, okay? But if one of those symptoms now appears that had not appeared in the previous week or 2 weeks, then it's determined that he's got tzara'at. The imlav, however, if not, harei ze tahor, he is determined to be tahor, to be pure, vayafti renu, and then he's let go. He's no longer put into quarantine. He's free to go. V'chein, and likewise, im tzachu ba shtei tzara'ot shcharot, and likewise, if in this little patch there were 2 black hairs that grew, tahorhu, he's considered tahor, he's considered pure. Ve'im la'achar shepatru, however, if after he's out of quarantine, he's free to go, nolad ba echad ma'elu, if one of these symptoms then develops again, right now, or simply develops, shuv eino maskiro, he is not going to be put into quarantine anymore, ela machalito miyad l'tumah, but it's determined immediately that he is in fact got tzara'at. So I don't want to go over the second one before I've had a chance to review it myself, but you can see how, I think at any rate, clearly and beautifully Torah Temimah tries to outline and clarify as best as he can this very arcane subject. And this is probably a good place for me to stop for today. And again, just to pause, if any of you would like to share anything.
So we are assuming that this is contagious.
No, I wouldn't say no. I wouldn't.
Okay, because why be?
It's true.
Why be set aside or
Right,
set
right,
out of the camp, which we find out later.
right. Well, so you're raising a good question, Golda. I'm
Right.
sorry if I'm interrupting you.
No, that's fine.
Yeah, so contagious is sort of an interesting word to use here, but the
Yeah.
truth is it is contagious. I said no, but only, let's say, from a physical point of view so much as contagious from a spiritual point of view. We know.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Because since this is an outward
correct
representation of something that you have done.
Right, because we know that when there's certain things like vessels, okay, clothing, human beings, food, all right, there are certain things that are subject to tamah. There's certain things that cannot become tameh, that cannot become impure. But the various things that are capable of contracting impurity can become, it's a contagious situation.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I think and leprosy is considered a very virulent kind of impurity. Again,
well, there's 2 kinds. There's 2 kinds of leprosy. There's the dry and the wet, but that's beside the point. We learned that in Alcatraz or something or whatever, the Great Escape or whatever.
Yeah. So the problem, of course, is that this term leprosy is so misunderstood and
right.
And it's not biblical leprosy, and it's a tragedy in a way that we've used that term to describe tzara'at,
right. Which
is why I tend to use tzara'at rather than leprosy, so to try to avoid confusion. It's considered to be a very severe form of impurity, and what I was going to say is what I believe we said off camera yesterday,
mm-hmm.
which is the degree to which damage is done if in fact tzara'at is a consequence of bad mouthing or slandering or something like that, then it's the way the Torah tells us how severe bad mouthing someone really is.
So this isn't something you can sacrifice your way out of.
No.
Right.
No, you have to simply, I imagine the way you do it essentially would be tshuva, right? Somehow to do some deep, deep self-analysis
mm-hmm.
and really determine that you're not going to do this again, and to try to be very, very conscious of when we fall into that trap, because it's such an easy trap to fall into. bad-mouthing someone. It's just so easy because we're emotional. And when we get emotional and we lose a certain amount of rational, behavior, and we're hurt by someone, it's just so easy to, but I think it's one thing I'd like to feel, because it seems to me that there are times when it's necessary to be able to vent. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, venting before God has to be totally safe. Okay. I mean, but the other piece is that being able to talk to someone who is either has the same relationship as you have with that person and loves them, right, and still loves them, possibly that's okay. I don't know. I think it's also sort of the coinage you get out of bad mouthing. I mean, I think there's a way you can use bad mouthing just to make yourself feel better, or kind of get a certain sad pleasure from bad mouthing people. And it's that kind of thing I think that's really so awful, is that when you sort of get some kind of secondary gain from bad mouthing. But I feel, one has to be able to get these things out when you have these kinds of feelings. And of course, as being able to create a relationship with your divine creator and being able to have hold conversation with your creator, it's very helpful.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to stop the recording with this.